So, ja, bisschen ungünstig, wenn ich nachnehme. Okay, all right. Are we ready? Everything's fine, recording and so on. Good. All right. So, let me move a few things out of the way. Yeah. All right. And that's the wrong talk. Sorry. All right. So, let's get started. I want to talk a bit about what you can do or some techniques you can apply when you've modeled something or you're about to model something and you have the goal to bring this over to some form of 3D real-time engine. What I had in mind was people who might want to participate in this 3D scene compo, as we have it here on Evoke, but also on other parties, where you then probably will use Foxotron to display your models. And the most basic use case I had in mind when creating this talk was someone building something in Blender and then trying to export this for viewing in Foxotron. That's something. A little bit about myself, Psykon from Mercury. I've been doing CGI stuff for a bit more than 20 years. That doesn't mean that I'm any good at it, just that I've seen some things in that regard. And yeah, my social links are down there. Yeah, I'm also doing mountain bikes and other stuff with Echtzeit, our association in Switzerland. All right, starting. Again, I told you about the use case I had in mind. And the way I'm going to approach this now with this talk is that there will be a small handful of slides with a bit of theory. Or I try to tell you a bit about my ideas when I approach something like this. And then I'm going to have 3 examples, practical examples, that are not step-by-step tutorials or something like that, but examples of different techniques of different techniques you can employ. And starting with the theory, I had the subtitle, The Story of Misunderstandings, because what usually leads to issues is something like this. Like a very usual workflow that you encounter in a lot of ways when you model something and you want to bring this into some kind of engine. This dichotomy of, yeah, you have your tool of choice. That does everything you want to do. That's why you use it. And that tool has been built over years and years and years. And the tool itself is able to structure the data that you create in any way that's comfortable for this application. Then you usually have some form of intermediate format, something you export to and want to import again. That only does very few things. The things it's standardized to do so that it can exchange stuff. And on the other hand, you have some kind of system where you import the data. This, on the other hand, usually, and at least nowadays, also does a lot of things, but then again in a very specific way, adhering to a very specific workflow, because it tries to optimize for things. And with that, you have multiple points of contact, where, from your point of view as an artist, that data represents the same thing, but underlying the formats, the applications, exporting scripts, and so on, have the task to interpret this data in a specific way. And this can lead to all kinds of issues. And issues that you usually run into with stuff like that is yeah, stuff is missing, stuff doesn't look right, it's some kind of messed up. You get a whole new world of issues when you're starting to deal with animation, and I've left this completely out of this talk because, yeah, that would explode things. Yeah, but you get into all those kind of bigger and more smaller, this doesn't look right issues, or this doesn't work right issues. And there's a specific skill involved with finding out what the underlying issue is. Because, of course, yeah, you want to fix this somehow. But I have these two examples like, okay, wrong shading because the values of your PBR shader are interpreted differently. On the other hand, you could have issues with the shading because your normals are wrong in the view of one of those components. And that's something you either need to approach with trial and error. You usually have to approach with trial and error, maybe with some debugging tooling that I'm going to go into a little bit afterwards. But like my main recommendation for anyone starting out is to do not get pushed away or do not get demotivated by those kinds of issues, because when you tackle them, when you do your trial and error, when you try it again, read the documentation again, try it in another way, you're building that skill of identifying specific issues, and you're able to then see them again with maybe another tool chain. So that's a skill you're building with it. It's not that you, oh, I'm doing something wrong, I'm not good at this, I should have known this better, so now I'm leaving this. It's a skill you're building over time. And yeah, when you take one thing out from this talk, I hope that it will be this. So, yeah. Another thing, I call this learn your pipeline, which basically just means don't just focus on the tools you have in front of this and how to use this, but try to think about a pipeline, this way of how data is transformed. And through that, try to think about where could issues arise, where can I change things up, and this can also mean reading a lot of documentation. And of course, having a talk and standing here and saying, well, yeah, you just have to read up also on those things, that's not really ideal advice. But I urge you to not just focus on information you can get out, like, oh, these are the export settings you should use, stuff like that. But mix those things up, try different things, and through that, learn how this pipeline works. What are the limitations of it? And just as an example for that, in Foxotron has a nice wiki on GitHub. You press a few links and you get to the examples of how to structure your materials. You have a nice screenshot, one from Blender, one from Max, showing you a default material with the connected nodes. That's a nice starting point. You can rebuild this, export it, it will probably work. But what happens if you change things up? What happens if I leave this node out? Because, just to explain this a little bit, I think the first time I played around with it, you have this really standard screenshot with one material and then 4 different textures for your diffuse, the albedo, roughness, metallic, and the normal map. And I thought, oh, well, it's easy. It's a standard material, things like that. I do this, I export it, and my model looked wrong. Why does it look wrong? Because I thought, well, I only have a simple metallic value, 0 or 1, that's in my material. I don't have to put a texture on there. for this kind of information. No, wrong. And thinking in the pipeline kind of sense, well, if this isn't negotiated between all of the elements, that there is this specific value that has to be transferred over, the applications will assume things. There will be default values and so on. So yeah, for me it has just taken a default value. I've learned through this, okay, I need to put my value in a texture. If it should be 0, I simply take a completely black picture. If it should be 1, it's a white picture. That's what I mean with this. And switch it up, try it out. Maybe also change from time to time a few of your formats to see how it behaves differently. That's how you build this skill. So, running now into the examples of it. And with the first example, and I have... Let's load this. All right. Let's say this is like from the viewpoint of you're just starting out with Blender. You do your first little thing with Blender. I didn't make a donut, so that it's a bit different than that. But let's say you have a very simple scene. You have a scene with shapes and colors. That's what you usually start out of. And when you want to export this, you have to find a way to represent this kind of information, this data, in a way that other tools can interpret it. Now, with a standard PBR workflow as Foxotron does it. Again, at the end, you want to have a material with all the data included in some form of map, in some form of bitmap. Now, if you're starting out with Blender, you probably, you do this thing. You have an object here, you have a material here, and let me just, where is my? And you standard material with your values in here. And every material has its own, every object has its own material. Now, if you would export this, the materials wouldn't look the same, because again, we have no associated image data that actually tells the next application, well, this should be orange, this should be black, this should be full metallic, zero metallic. And the little technique I want to show you here is when you just have such a simple scene, what you could do is like you go in and for each of these materials you create the maps, and you can do just a 16 by 16 PNG with that one color, but then you start to get into a lot of file management, stuff like that. It can get cumbersome. What I like to do with such simple scenes like that is to get a bit into UV unwrapping. Very simple one, and I know that's usually for a lot of people, that's the workflow step they dislike the most, for good reasons. But at the end of the day, when we think about, well, what's the minimum requirement that we need to have, like the minimum set of data that my DCC, my format, and the target system all understand. It's UVs mapped somewhere on a picture linked to a material. That's like the starting point. And what I like to do is have something like this, a color palette that I use to distribute my colors in the scene. So the way I would approach this is then to load this as an image texture. That's the 3D16 palette, by the way. And we can load our UV editor here. Open the image here. And of course we need to connect this. And now I would just go into, select those and scale it down to whatever color I want it to be. Again, the UVs don't have to be correct. They can overlapping, they can be weirdly scaled. I just use them to say, these faces should have this color. You can start to simplify your scene because you can start to, for example, merge things together. And now we have the sphere here. And for the sphere, of course, now it has multiple materials, but I can remove this. I can now have a single material. And for this, I can choose the correct colors. Now we have a few different values we also have to take care of, the metallic and the roughness. And for those, I've mentioned this beforehand, but I usually have this like black.png, which is the smallest valuable PNG I have, and I have this with a light gray, a dark gray, a white one, which are like my simplest values that I have. And through this, I can simply here get the black one, connect this to the metallic, and then do the same thing with the white, and I connect this to the roughness. Now, usually, we would also need a normal map, but if you try out with what works and what doesn't work, yeah, the default value for the normal is simply 0 with no modification of the normal, so we can leave this out. Again, that's something that you usually don't have in a documentation or thing like that. You just try it out. What can I leave away? What can I get? What's the minimum set I can get away with? And that would be like my first tip for someone just starting out, is like something like this, in my viewpoint, is pretty much the simplest way you can structure such a scene. You have one material, and through the placement of the UVs, you can select what color should this have. And then once exporting this, because it's also such a minimal setup, now if things doesn't work right, it's much easier to start debug it, to start change things up. You're not in the realm of, well, I have 50 different materials and 100 different texture set, and somewhere something is broken. You have a pretty simple scene to work with, and with that can have also a bit of a easier time to debug it. Moving forward, the second example I have for this would be what to do when you have more complex materials. Because, yeah, of course, it's okay to just restrict yourself to make things a bit easier, but of course, from time to time, you have built those really great things in Blender, and you want to start to move this over. So let's say, again, we have multiple materials. Actually, this scene I made with this was used to then export and import it to cables. With cables, I have a bit of an other approach, so I repurposed this. In cables, I try to keep the numbers of material to a minimum, because I have to rebuild them in cables. So I tried, to keep them as a minimum, so I don't have that much work. But I thought it was I can use the ground here as in a example, because it will happen quite a lot, especially in most tools, that you will have a mix of different materials. So on here, we have at least 2 full PBR materials with their full sets of textures, normals, and so on. And this is just a simple, well, this face is assigned to this material, this face is assigned to this material. This will work in quite a lot of circumstances. It will not work once you go to a system where one object has one material. Again, this is, some pipelines will support it, other pipelines won't. And as long as I'm not sure what pipeline I'm gonna use, you do have cases where you may be working with a demo tool that has already a specific exporter written for Maya. You have this very strict pipeline with your own exporter, it's fine. A lot, especially as artists, we just start building stuff and we are maybe not completely sure how this will get used. So I try then to think about, well, again, what's the minimal set that I can represent this? What's the least complex material and object setup that I can use for this scene? And that's the way then how I'm gonna save it. So makes it simpler for all possible use cases that come afterward, that I don't have to maybe then debug or simplify things again. And this will just be having something like this and trying to break this down to one material will just be the process of baking. So rendering it down to one texture set. And that's a pretty big topic. I'm going to show it to you shortly. What's the main idea behind this? Again, we have here 2 materials with their complete sets. I'm gonna do just a dummy plane on here. And let's just line this up some way. All right. We need our dummy object that we gonna project things onto. This set, again, it will need some UVs, which, okay, on a plane we already have this, and the UE set is very, very simple for that. We will give this a material, and in Blender specifically, we need a new texture. So, make an image texture, we make this. Let's do this just small. Create this new texture. And when we're in the render settings, we have this little. That's the issue why I got the second monitor that doesn't work. I have to skew it. So, in our render settings, we have here the bake option, where I can select from selected to active. So this is our selected, this is our active. We select the image texture that we want to bake to, and say, for example, we just want to have our diffuse. I bake this, and this is running okay-ish currently. Now here, again, we have one image with both of these textures. We also have the shadows in here that are casted. Sometimes that can be wanted, sometimes not. This is just the exploration of the basic idea. I have a very complex object with multiple materials. The main idea, I want to bring this down to, I describe it as the least moving parts that I can have. And moving parts in that case means just things that can change in the process of bringing it from one system to another. And trying to break this down to, well, now we have just one texture which combines both of them. We can do this then for the roughness, metallic, normal, and so on. You can already guess this is a bit of a cumbersome thing. I personally use a plugin called Simple Bake that allows you basically to just have one setup as a preset, have one object, another object, press bake, and it will write down all the make a new material, write down the maps to disks, things like that, and I have a link to that afterwards for those interested. But I just wanted to show it to you with the basic built-in Blender tools, just to get the concept. To go from then something, that's a rubber one. Go from something like the cobblestone tiling texture, then to something that really represents your specific object. Can also help with if you have multiple like 4K textures that aren't really needed, and break this down. So, and again, this was mostly about the concept. Now we do have ways to start to combine things from those two examples, and also to show you one approach that I really like, which goes kind of from backwards to front. In that if our basic data sets are the bitmaps and the UVs that we have, and maybe not really all the great additional tools that we have in our DCC, why not start with those elements? And I can, delete the base default cube, and I'm gonna import here. That's from FBX. That was from an entry from Inertia a few years ago, I think. Oh, this. All right. Oh, that's like basic sci-fi structure. Idea that I did there. The main goal was to have very high resolution feeling textures on here. In the limitations that we had there in the 3D compo. So again, maximum 4K textures, maximum 50 megabyte file size for everything. And I still wanted to be able to zoom in a lot, have all those details, have stuff like here the traverses, things like that. And the way this is done is that the whole scene has 3 materials in total, with 3 PBR sets of materials. And then when we look at the shading tab, so so there are quite a lot of objects in here, but again, the materials are quite simple, and the materials usually look like this. These are our texture atlases, as they're usually known. It's a bitmap with different kinds of texture information in one image. And it works best when I show it to you with this one main structure here. So this are the UVs. I hope that's visible. These are the UVs of this element right here. And that's how the texture looks. And it has the roughness and metallic values and normal map for this. The way this works is if I select and need to let me just open the actual blend file and not the PBR. So there's my surface 1 albedo there. So if I just select one ring here, one ring of polygons, you can see this is laid out vertically. And this works because UV space is repeating after 0 and 1. So this is intended to tile on the x-axis. And by simply grabbing them and moving them, I can select what is shown on this part of the model. This is a bit what I mean with working backwards. I create structures in my textures, then start modeling things, and through the UV layouting process, decide what kind of structure goes on here, which makes also the kind of UV unwrapping process a lot more enjoyable if I'm working this way. And you can start to mix things up in this way. So for example, I could also just select those two and maybe move them somewhere else. Now I can break up those repeating patterns. A similar thing, and I'm struggling with navigation here, similar thing with all those extra structures that are semi-transparent. So this is on another. Where do we have it? Sorry about that. So, yeah. This is just this kind of structure mapped to some planes or mapped to the side of a cube, this part. That's a little tip for you working with Foxotron. Foxotron supports alpha transparency. If or at least for me, it works the way if I have it as the alpha channel in the albedo texture. So setting up the material then, I'm going to do for the transparency, that's this image you see here with albedo and the alpha texture, and the color goes to the base color, the alpha goes to the alpha. That's worked for me at least through the last few versions of Foxotron. Some words I've started in this project with those texture atlases, and actually I already have this. So I've built those structures in Blender, as you can see here. And then just like the technique I showed you beforehand, just having a plane and bake this out into one texture set. Then creating the materials and then starting with the actual modeling. And yeah, I also have that was that was for all the surfaces. This is still the version where I just did. In this variant, I did just color maps and then textured it in a different application. But principles is the same. I just tried to have a few interesting structures with different things, create my tileable in one axis materials, and then laid it out. And here's also, for example, down there you can see it pretty nicely how here I've laid it out in the, like I've selected strips and then placed them on the texture map on the panels 1. No, not the panels 1. And yeah, took strips and then took some individual strips of them, moved them to something else so that it's not just one repeating tileable structure over the whole model, but that it's mixed up. And with this approach, basically, the nice thing is, since I started out this way, I know that I'm always in this kind of minimal set, what I know what is supported. I don't get into the habit of, building something very, very interesting, and now I have to think about how do I break this down, which can be quite a struggle. It can also be a bit demotivating because things that looked really great beforehand now don't really do that much anymore. So I highly recommend to play around with workflows that keep you in that space all the time. You had a question? Yeah?
Yeah, so I was wondering, you said you made the structure and you rendered it a texture instead of, but I was wondering how come you did that instead of just keeping the mesh around? Can you repeat the question for the part?
Yeah. The question was why I hope I got it right. The question was why I baked this down to textures and not just use the meshes that I already had. Then use this. It basically comes down to complexity. One thing was there are limitations on the number of vertices on faces that will be allowed in the competition. That was one thing. Another thing was also just complexity in general with everything. If I kept as an example, if I kept all the meshes, there will be a lot of transformations going on there, modifiers, again, a lot of different materials placed on different parts, and each of those could become an issue at some time in the future that I then may have to debug. So for me, this project was really mostly there to force me to stay in a place that I already knew this will work, and I could test it out on a small scale and then get it a bit bigger. So, yeah. Yes.
With a lot of these models, it looks like you can just take the face and move it along in the UV.
Mm-hmm.
Did you create like each of the square intersections where you have the vertices? Did you create like separate vertices for each different face, or are they one vertice? Because in Blender, I remember when they're one vertice and you try to move across it to the UV map only remembers like if an object has like shared vertices like in there, then it will skew the UVs also of the next like of the next triangles next to it or squares or shapes.
Yeah.
Did you separate out each of these squares or what happened there?
The way I approach it, the question was if if I put special focus on the layout of the vertices to not get into trouble with the way Blender deals with the edge, the edge of those, I didn't really thought too much about it. What I did is I modeled it in a way that I thought would lend itself to repeating structures, so loops. In this example, I basically just made a torus, and then took each of those loops. I had one cut in between, unwrapped this, and then just very crudely started placing it here. The thing is, if this would have gone into a commercial project or into an asset store or something like that, I would probably have been really looking into those. And then it would probably make sense to have the scale of everything in a way that that aids itself to the tiling structure of the textures. Here, for me, it was really mostly. I knew some things, you know. If the texture itself, there are 4 main parts. So I've divided it into 4 main parts, with the possibility to also just select small strips of them. But well, 4 main parts. I can get a bit of a gut feeling how many loops my torus should have and things like that, that it matches somewhat, that I don't stretch it too much. But no, really, for something like this, if there are some weird scenes in between, I don't care too much.
That means that these are like the vertices horizontally are shared, but like when vertically these loops are separate, like these vertices
Yes.
are separate. Okay,
Yes. I only yet the one thing with those texture atlases, everything where something is tiling, so wrapping around, I've designed it in a way that it's only doing this in one axis and only used it this way. So I can use it for certain loops, but not for areas, so to speak.
In this context, so with this technique, how badly do you suffer from cracks? Because there must be discontinuities in your textures. So if you like would zoom in really, really strong, you should be able to see texturing problems that stem from discontinuities in the UV map, right?
From discontinuities, and what you can already see here, there's warping going on. You know, yeah, you have those issues. The more you want to get rid of those, the more manual hassle you're gonna have, because yeah, things need to match up ideally. The way I approach it in some way is, how does the main thing you're gonna look at?
So with colors, I guess this is mostly fine. If you zoom out a little, my main concern would be with displacement maps, because displacement maps really extremely suffer from this kind of problem as soon you have it.
The way I would do this, if my pipeline would support it, would be to have another set of UVs that aren't tileable, have the displacement map just mapped to this, because the displacement map maybe doesn't need to be that high resolution. Here we don't do anything with the mesh. We aren't displacing it. We are working with normals, and yeah, in the normals, this can also be something where issues in the continuity, you kind of see them. This is really so much of this model, and this scene was purpose-built for this kind of workflow. That's also why I would say probably it works kind of okay. There are also like examples, the big panels on here. I have one material and one texture that's just for those panels. because I know they are big and they look different from the other things. I didn't try to incorporate this into the other texture atlases because that again would have been a hassle.
Just a short notice.
Yeah.
Officially 5 minutes. We can make maybe a little bit longer because of build-up, but we need to be prepared that eventually the combo will start.
Yes.
Parallel,
So I think I have 2 or 3 slides. I would go over those, and then maybe we can also find some time outside. Again, because I just wanted to go back again a bit to the general advice thing. Again, trying to figure out what is the minimal set of data that you know is supported, and playing around with those, getting comfortable with them. I also advise to switch tools from time to time. Different tools, different issues, still helps to build those kind of skills, because you're getting out of your comfort zone. Helps. Here with baking, I also mean stuff, not just texture baking, but it could also mean maybe you have tools for procedural generation in your models. This again needs to be broken down into something in this baseline of my DCC, my format, my target engine, all understand this. Getting familiar with debugging tools, with that I mean stuff like, show me the distribution of the normals. Maybe you can show on your model the skewing of the UV space. Stuff like that. Blender isn't great at this, in my opinion, for debugging tool. So I always recommend people to get a reference viewer, some tool to view your work and your model that isn't your DCC, isn't your target platform, but something which can aid as a reference. I use F3D for that one. I like it, and it also has some features again like showing wireframes and normal distribution. You can do some things with lightning. I like it. And that just, again, this whole idea of thinking about the pipeline and where data will get touched and trying to eliminate much of those. Some specific Blender advice, again, this apply everything means press Ctrl-A a lot. That's something just for people really starting out with Blender. When you do, for example, a scaling in Blender, S, and you scale it up. Internally in Blender, this will get saved as, this is my size, and now I have a scaling operation applied to it. It hasn't changed the actual size. I think with the apply, Ctrl-A, you get this apply transform. This means, yeah, apply this transformation, and you also get this in most export dialogues. You have some kind of check marks, apply all transformation and things like that. This will save you from things just having the wrong size or at the wrong place. Everything should have UVs. This doesn't mean it needs to be beautiful UV maps or something like that, but everything should point somewhere in your UV space. Everything should have bitmap textures. And learning to bake, getting a good add-on really, really helps. And checking all the options on your exporter, especially if you upgrade to a new Blender version. Check the how the export option may have changed, because that's, I've run into this a few times. You're already so used to your workflow and you're doing, and then stuff breaks. That's a good first place to look at. And one thing I want to show you this, get familiar with how Blender stores data. When there's a neat little trick when you're in the outliner. Usually it looks like this, you know. Very, very many cubes with no titles. But it's not what I want to talk about. Usually you have this scene collection. There's this drop down, this option here. This is what the outliner actually shows to you. And you can select things like Blender file. And now you have all your images at one place. You have the same with objects and materials. And you can even go so far and go to data API. This is the same output that you would get if you would script it with Python. And then when we go into the objects, the first cube, you also have all the data that is associated with that object. When you're starting to look where things go wrong, this can be really helpful, having this kind of view into your data that you're modeling with. And that was the last part. So thanks. I've put some links to the tools I mentioned also on here, the Evoke 24.psykon.net. I think it's only 2. I try to put the slides on there sometime next week or something like that. So, yeah, thanks everyone for being here, and come around if you have some more questions. I'll try to get a hold of them. Yeah.